In the autumn of 1944, a German soldier found himself holding something that seemed impossible given the circumstances of his capture. Wilhelm Krauss, holding the rank of Unteroffizier in the Wehrmacht, sat in the confines of Camp Shelby, Mississippi, staring at a document that challenged everything he understood about warfare and captivity. The pages before him were not the interrogation forms he might have expected, nor were they propaganda materials designed to break his spirit. Instead, what lay in his hands was a catalogue from the University of Chicago, filled with legitimate academic courses that promised actual college credits to prisoners of war like himself. The American lieutenant overseeing the distribution of these materials had taken the time to explain the program not once but twice, speaking deliberately in English, while another prisoner, one who had learned the language before the war, translated the words into German. The concept itself seemed almost absurd in its generosity. Here were men who had been firing weapons at American soldiers on the beaches of Normandy just 4 months earlier, and now they were being offered the opportunity to earn university degrees from American educational institutions. The contrast with what education had become in Germany under National Socialist rule could not have been more stark. Back in the Third Reich, universities had undergone a transformation that had little to do with genuine learning and everything to do with political indoctrination. Since 1933, when the Nazi Party consolidated its power, German institutions of higher education had been systematically purged of Jewish professors and anyone who valued independent thought over party loyalty. The pursuit of knowledge had been replaced by the recitation of ideology, and critical thinking had become not just discouraged, but dangerous. Yet here, behind the barbed wire fences of an enemy prisoner of war camp on foreign soil, educational opportunities were opening up that had been firmly closed in his homeland for over a decade. That night, Krauss sat down with his journal and attempted to capture the strangeness of his situation in words. "We are captives," he wrote carefully, "but they offer us knowledge that was forbidden at home." It was a sentiment that would be echoed by thousands of other German prisoners as the months progressed and the scope of the educational program expanded far beyond anyone's initial expectations. The numbers themselves tell a story of remarkable scale. Between 1943 and 1946, approximately 375,000 German prisoners would pass through the American camp system. Among this substantial population, thousands would choose to participate in educational programs that began with modest ambitions but evolved into something far more comprehensive and transformative. What military authorities initially conceived as simple diversion, a way to keep idle prisoners occupied and prevent trouble, would develop into an unprecedented experiment in using education as a tool of ideological transformation, converting former enemies into future allies through patient academic instruction rather than forced conversion or crude propaganda techniques. The genesis of this program lay not in grand ideological schemes, but in practical necessities that camp commanders faced daily. By the time autumn arrived in 1944, American camps were holding more than 200,000 German prisoners, with new arrivals streaming in on a monthly basis as the war in Europe continued. These men had nothing but time on their hands, and boredom became a breeding ground for all manner of problems. Nazi hardliners among the prisoner population used intimidation and violence to terrorize fellow prisoners who dared to question the ideology of Hitler or the inevitability of German victory. Camp commanders filed reports describing rising tensions within the wire, including suicide attempts and violent clashes between different factions of prisoners. Something needed to be done to occupy minds that had too much idle time and to counter the Nazi intimidation that was creating dangerous conditions within the camps themselves. The solution emerged from the bureaucratic machinery of the Provost Marshal General's office in October 1944. A newly created entity called the Special Projects Division came into being with the specific mandate of providing what officials carefully termed intellectual diversion for the prisoner population. Leading this division was Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, a man whose background made him uniquely suited for the delicate task ahead. Born in Scotland, Davison had immigrated to America and become a citizen, building a career as a poet and eventually teaching at the University of Colorado. He understood both the requirements of military discipline and the principles of academic freedom, two domains that do not always coexist comfortably. The mandate given to Davison was deliberately vague in its specifics, allowing for flexibility in implementation while maintaining strict compliance with the Geneva Convention's prohibitions against propaganda directed at prisoners of war. This vagueness would prove to be one of the program's great strengths, allowing it to evolve organically in response to what worked and what prisoners actually wanted to study. What distinguished the American approach from other forms of prisoner management was its fundamental subtlety and respect for genuine learning. Rather than resorting to crude propaganda films or forced indoctrination sessions that would likely backfire by creating resentment, the program offered authentic education that was indistinguishable in quality from what American universities provided to their own students. There were no political litmus tests to pass, no loyalty oaths to sign, no requirements to denounce previous beliefs. There was only knowledge, freely offered and freely accepted. The Americans were making a calculated gamble that exposure to uncensored learning and free inquiry would prove far more persuasive than any propaganda campaign could possibly achieve, no matter how well crafted or extensively funded. The initial efforts were necessarily modest in their scope, but meaningful in their execution and implications. At Fort Eustis in Virginia, during November 1944, 28 German prisoners enrolled in a course on American history taught by professors who made the journey from the College of William and Mary. The classroom itself was nothing impressive, just a converted mess hall with a blackboard that had been salvaged from a demolished barracks. The physical surroundings might have been makeshift and improvised, but the education being delivered was entirely authentic, complete with rigorous examinations, formal grades, and academic credit that would later prove valuable when these men returned to civilian life in Germany. Among those first students was a man named Hans Müller, who held the rank of Gefreiter. Müller had attended Berlin University briefly before his conscription into military service had interrupted his studies. His experience of German higher education under Nazi rule had been disillusioning. Professors wore Nazi party badges on their lapels and began each lecture with Hitler salutes. Academic discussion meant reciting party doctrine verbatim rather than engaging in genuine intellectual exploration. Critical analysis was not just absent, but actively dangerous. Now, in this converted mess hall in an American prisoner camp, Müller found himself sitting in a classroom where an American professor actively encouraged prisoners to question his interpretations, debate different viewpoints, and reach their own independent conclusions based on evidence and reasoning. The contrast struck Müller with a force that he would remember and reflect upon for decades after the war ended. By the time January 1945 arrived, the program had expanded dramatically beyond those modest beginnings at Fort Eustis. The University of Chicago launched an ambitious correspondence course program that would be made available to all camps throughout the country that held German prisoners. Stanford University contributed agricultural science programs that would go on to revolutionize farming practices in post-war Germany. Princeton sent political science materials that had been banned in the Third Reich for their democratic content. Yale contributed philosophy and literature texts that had been destroyed in Nazi book burnings or removed from library shelves as ideologically dangerous. These prestigious American institutions offered their educational resources not because of government compulsion or financial incentives, but through voluntary participation in what they saw as democratic education's power to transform minds and societies. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, the program achieved a scope that impressed even its organizers. By February 1945, more than 600 prisoners were enrolled in various courses spanning multiple disciplines. Professors from Duke University and the University of North Carolina volunteered their time as instructors, making the drive to the camp twice each week, despite the gasoline rationing that made such trips inconvenient and costly. They taught subjects ranging from English literature to mechanical engineering, approaching their prisoner students not as enemies requiring surveillance and suspicion, but as students deserving of respect and intellectual engagement. The content of these courses systematically challenged Nazi assumptions about race, society, and human potential. In sociology classes, prisoners studied immigration patterns that demonstrated how America's strength derived from diversity rather than racial purity. Economics courses introduced market mechanisms and the concept of consumer choice, ideas that had been dismissed in Nazi education as Jewish materialism corrupting the folk community. Psychology classes explored how human behavior was shaped by environment and experience rather than determined by immutable racial destiny fixed at birth and unalterable through any intervention. Kurt Wagner, a Feldwebel studying at Camp Concordia in Kansas through courses provided by Kansas State College, encountered philosophy that had been banned in Germany for more than a decade. He read John Locke's treatises on government and discovered ideas about natural rights and social contracts that directly contradicted everything he had been taught about authoritarian rule being natural and necessary. Rousseau's writings on popular sovereignty, Mill's passionate arguments for individual liberty, all of this forbidden knowledge that could have meant imprisonment or worse in the Third Reich, became required reading assignments in an American prison camp situated in the middle of rural Kansas. The agricultural programs transformed how German farmers understood productivity and land management. At Camp Clarinda in Iowa, working with instructors from Iowa State College, prisoners learned about hybrid seeds that had been developed through genetic science rather than the mystical blood and soil ideology promoted by Nazi agricultural policy. They studied mechanization techniques that multiplied human effort and efficiency rather than relying on the conquest of foreign lands to expand agricultural capacity. Soil conservation methods, crop rotation systems, and scientific fertilization approaches replaced the primitive methods that had been mandated by Nazi agricultural policy and had failed to adequately feed Germany even before the war began. Literature courses introduced works that mere possession of in Germany could mean imprisonment or execution. At Camp Hearn in Texas, working with Southern Methodist University, prisoners read American authors who criticized their own society without fear of reprisal or accusations of treason. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath depicted American poverty and economic injustice openly and unflinchingly. Sinclair Lewis's novel It Can't Happen Here warned against the possibility of American fascism with bitter satire. Richard Wright's Native Son confronted racial violence in American society directly and powerfully. These books demonstrated to prisoners that democratic societies could tolerate profound self-criticism and even celebrate it as patriotic truth-telling rather than condemning it as treason against the nation. The science courses proved particularly eye-opening for prisoners who had been told repeatedly about German scientific superiority. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, through the University of Southern Mississippi, German prisoners studied physics and chemistry without the ideological distortions that had crept into German science under Nazi influence. Dr. Wilhelm Fischer, a trained chemist who had worked on synthetic fuel development for the Wehrmacht, attended lectures on atomic theory that surpassed anything that had been available to him in wartime Germany. American professors were sharing cutting-edge knowledge with enemy prisoners, while German scientists worked in enforced isolation, forbidden to collaborate with colleagues who had been deemed racially inferior by government policy. Music education provided yet another avenue for intellectual liberation from Nazi cultural restrictions. At Camp Edwards in Massachusetts, Boston University provided musical instruments and sheet music that included jazz, which the Nazi regime had banned as degenerate Negro music unfit for German ears. German prisoners formed jazz ensembles and played music that would have resulted in their imprisonment in concentration camps had they performed it at home. They studied the works of Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and Louis Armstrong, discovering artistic genius and sophisticated musicianship in artists whom their ideology had taught them to regard as subhuman. The bitter irony of this revelation was not lost on thoughtful prisoners. The camp libraries became centers of intellectual awakening for men who had been starved of genuine knowledge. Universities donated thousands of volumes in German translation to make them accessible to the prisoner population. Yale University alone contributed 3,000 books to various camps scattered throughout the country. Prisoners who had been restricted to Nazi-approved literature for over a decade suddenly found themselves with access to world knowledge spanning centuries and continents. They read Sigmund Freud and Albert Einstein, both of whose works had been banned as Jewish science corrupting pure German thought. They studied Charles Darwin, whose theory of evolution through natural selection contradicted Nazi racial mythology at its foundation. They discovered American pragmatist philosophy, British empiricism, and French existentialism, entire schools of thought that had been erased from German intellectual life through systematic censorship. At Fort Robinson in Nebraska, working through the University of Nebraska, prisoners studied American economics, including texts by Paul Samuelson, whose work had been forbidden in Germany for its Jewish origins and liberal assumptions. They learned about supply and demand curves, market equilibrium, and consumer sovereignty as organizing principles. The courses presented capitalism not as a Jewish conspiracy or system of exploitation as Nazi propaganda had taught, but as a system of voluntary exchange that generated prosperity through individual choice rather than state command and central planning. The implications for Germany's future economic reconstruction were clear to anyone paying attention. The revelation of the concentration camps in April 1945 created a profound moral crisis that education helped prisoners process and understand. Rather than showing propaganda films or forcing confessions of collective guilt, professors led analytical discussions about how civilized nations commit barbarism and what psychological and social factors enable genocide. At Camp Shelby, instructors from the University of Southern Mississippi guided prisoners through historical examples of mass violence from multiple eras and cultures, examining the psychological mechanisms and social conditions that enable ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. The approach was scholarly rather than accusatory, allowing prisoners to reach their own moral conclusions about their nation's crimes rather than having judgment forced upon them. The advanced programs established at Fort Kearny in Rhode Island and Fort Getty on nearby Jamestown Island represented the culmination of everything the educational program had learned and accomplished. Selected prisoners attended intensive 60-day courses specifically designed to prepare them for administrative roles in the occupation of Germany that everyone knew was coming. The curriculum included public administration, constitutional law, and democratic governance principles. 528 prisoners graduated from Fort Getty's administration school alone, returning to Germany equipped with knowledge and skills that would prove invaluable in the reconstruction effort. At Fort Kearny, prisoners published a newspaper called Der Ruf that evolved from subtle resistance to Nazi ideology to open advocacy for democratic principles. They had access to American publications that had been banned in Germany for over a decade, and they worked to translate and distribute this material to camps nationwide, spreading democratic ideas through the prisoner network. Business courses introduced management philosophies that were antithetical to Nazi industrial organization. At Camp Gordon in Georgia, working through the University of Georgia, prisoners studied labor relations based on negotiation and mutual benefit rather than coercion and command. They learned about profit-sharing arrangements, worker participation in decision-making, and corporate social responsibility. These concepts directly contradicted the militarized hierarchy of German industry under National Socialism, where workers had been treated essentially as industrial soldiers to be commanded, rather than employees to be engaged. The language programs extended far beyond utilitarian English instruction for basic communication. At Camp Mexia in Texas, through Paris Junior College, prisoners could study Spanish, French, and Russian in addition to English. The implicit message carried by this linguistic diversity was powerful and deliberate. Educated people embraced linguistic diversity as a source of cultural richness rather than imposing linguistic hegemony on subject populations. This approach contradicted Nazi policies that had banned minority languages in occupied territories and mandated German as the sole language of administration and education, policies that had alienated populations and fueled resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the educational programs intensified their efforts rather than winding down in anticipation of war's end. With Germany's defeat now certain and occupation a reality rather than a possibility, the focus shifted explicitly from occupation to reconstruction. Prisoners studied urban planning focused on human needs and community building, public health administration emphasizing prevention and universal access, and educational reform prioritizing critical thinking over rote memorization. They were being prepared not merely to survive military defeat, but to rebuild their nation on democratic foundations that would be radically different from the totalitarian structure they had served and defended. The University of Minnesota established a formal credit transfer program allowing prisoners to earn academic credentials that would be recognized by German universities when they returned home. Iowa State Teachers College offered teaching certificates to prisoners who successfully completed education courses and demonstrated competency in pedagogical methods. These professional qualifications would prove invaluable in post-war Germany's desperate need for educators who were untainted by Nazi ideology. Former Wehrmacht soldiers would return home qualified to teach democratic principles in reconstructed German schools, carrying American pedagogical methods into classrooms where Nazi doctrine had recently been the only acceptable curriculum. At Camp Algoner in Iowa, 300 prisoners earned teaching certificates that would qualify them to establish and operate schools in occupied Germany under American supervision. They studied American pedagogical methods that emphasized critical thinking over rote memorization, encouraging students to question authority rather than practicing blind obedience. They learned to teach democracy not as propaganda or ideology to be absorbed uncritically, but as practical problem-solving through collective decision-making and respect for individual rights. These men would shape an entire generation of German students in democratic values and civic participation. The technical courses prepared prisoners for the practical challenges that Reconstruction would inevitably bring. At Camp Chaffee in Arkansas, through the University of Arkansas, prisoners studied civil engineering focused on rebuilding civilian infrastructure rather than constructing military fortifications. They learned about sewage treatment systems, water purification plants, and electrical distribution networks, all infrastructure knowledge that would be crucial for Germany's devastated cities. These practical skills would make them valuable assets in reconstruction efforts, providing career paths beyond military service in a defeated nation. Mathematics and physics courses demonstrated that American theoretical sophistication equaled or exceeded German achievements in these fields. At Camp Carson in Colorado, prisoners studied advanced calculus and quantum mechanics with professors from the University of Denver. They discovered that American science had advanced beyond German achievements, not through any inherent racial superiority as Nazi ideology claimed, but through international collaboration and open exchange of ideas across national and ethnic boundaries. The lesson extended beyond science itself to society as a whole and how knowledge advances. The repatriation process that began in early 1946 included remarkable educational gestures that surprised even sympathetic observers. Several universities offered full scholarships for exceptional prisoner students to continue their education in America rather than returning immediately to Germany. Yale, Chicago, and Stanford all extended such opportunities to carefully selected individuals. While exact numbers vary in historical records and have been debated by scholars, these offers came without political conditions or loyalty requirements, based solely on academic merit and potential. The message conveyed was clear and powerful. Education transcended even the bitterness of warfare between nations. The program's immediate impact became visible almost immediately in occupied Germany. Former prisoner students served effectively as interpreters, administrators, and educators in the American occupation zone. They understood American methods and assumptions through educational experience rather than merely following orders. Their cooperation stemmed from intellectual conviction rather than simple compliance with superior force. They became bridges between occupiers and occupied populations, facilitating reconstruction efforts through shared educational experiences and mutual respect developed in unlikely classroom settings. The long-term impact exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the program's architects. By 1950, thousands of former prisoner students held influential positions throughout West German government, business enterprises, and educational institutions. They implemented lessons learned during their captivity about democratic governance, free market economics, and civil society organization. The Federal Republic's remarkably rapid democratization owed much to these men who had discovered freedom's deeper meaning in American prison camps through university courses rather than political indoctrination or forced conversion. Dr. Werner Steinberg, who studied chemistry through MIT correspondence courses while imprisoned at Camp Stark in New Hampshire, became instrumental in rebuilding Munich's Technical University after the war. He introduced laboratory methods and research approaches he had learned during his captivity, training an entire generation of German scientists in American methodologies and collaborative research practices. Hans Zimmermann, who studied agriculture at Camp Mexia in Texas, established cooperative farms in Bavaria that helped feed starving Germans using techniques and principles he had learned as a prisoner of war. Otto Kraus, who learned engineering at Camp Trinidad in Colorado, directed the reconstruction of bombed infrastructure throughout southern Germany using American planning principles that prioritized human needs over industrial efficiency. In 1965, 2 decades after the war's end, Yale University hosted a reunion for former prisoners who had participated in their educational programs during the war years. 47 men attended, traveling from Germany to reconnect with professors and fellow students from their time in captivity. Among those present were constitutional court judges implementing American legal principles in German law, publishers distributing formerly banned literature to hungry German readers, engineers rebuilding cities with human-centered design principles, and educators teaching critical thinking to German youth. They had transformed from Nazi soldiers serving a totalitarian regime into democratic leaders through education received as prisoners of war in a foreign land. The statistics reveal the program's truly significant scope when examined comprehensively. Between 1944 and 1946, American universities provided educational services to more than 300 prisoner of war camps scattered across 45 states. Thousands of German prisoners completed university-level courses in multiple disciplines, though exact enrollment numbers remain debated by historians working with incomplete records. Hundreds earned technical certifications that proved valuable in reconstruction efforts. Many qualified as teachers for Germany's educational rebuilding, carrying democratic pedagogical methods back to their homeland. The total cost of the entire program remained under $5 million, less than the price of 20 bomber aircraft, making it one of the most cost-effective programs of the entire American war effort when measured by long-term strategic impact. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German prisoners was stark and carried enormous consequences for post-war European politics. In Russian camps, prisoners faced starvation rations, brutal forced labor, and crude political indoctrination sessions. Death rates exceeded 35% of all prisoners taken. Survivors who eventually returned to Germany came back broken physically and bitter emotionally, becoming enduring sources of anti-Soviet sentiment in post-war German society. American-educated prisoners, by contrast, returned as articulate advocates for democracy and Atlantic partnership with Western nations. This fundamental difference in treatment shaped Germany's Cold War orientation and political development for generations, cementing West Germany's firm alignment with democratic nations against Soviet pressure. The program succeeded precisely because it trusted education over indoctrination and respected prisoners' intelligence. Rather than forcing prisoners to mouth democratic slogans they did not believe, American universities taught them to think critically about all political systems, including their own. Rather than demanding immediate political conversion as proof of rehabilitation, professors offered intellectual tools for independent analysis and judgment. Rather than propaganda thinly disguised as education, they provided genuine knowledge with academic integrity. The approach reflected democracy's core confidence that free minds, when given access to uncensored information and genuine education, will ultimately choose freedom over tyranny through reasoned reflection rather than emotional manipulation. Looking back across the decades, the German prisoner education program represents one of history's most successful experiments in transformation through learning rather than force. Without coercion or traditional propaganda techniques, American universities helped convert Nazi soldiers into democratic citizens and future leaders. They proved that even in the midst of total war, even when dealing with committed enemies, education could bridge the deepest ideological divides and heal apparently unbridgeable cultural rifts. The program demonstrated conclusively that patient teaching could accomplish what military victory alone could never achieve, changing hearts and minds rather than merely compelling outward compliance. The last known participant in the program, Hans Müller, died in 2018 at the age of 95 in the state of Maine, where he had taught German language and literature at the University of Maine for 30 years after immigrating to America in 1953. His final interview, recorded 2 years before his death when he was 93, captured the program's essence with simple eloquence that no academic analysis could match. They could have treated us as criminals deserving punishment for our nation's crimes, Müller reflected. Instead, they treated us as students capable of learning and intellectual growth. They gave us not revenge for what Germany had done, but knowledge to build something better. In doing so, they transformed enemies into allies, warriors into scholars, destroyers into builders of a better future. This was America's greatest victory in the war, greater than any battlefield triumph. Today, when international education faces new suspicions and academic exchange is sometimes questioned as a security risk in an age of renewed great power competition, the German prisoner education program offers timeless lessons worth remembering and applying. It demonstrated beyond any doubt that education transcends nationalism and narrow political agendas, that learning can transform even the most thoroughly indoctrinated minds when offered with integrity, that treating former enemies as potential students and intellectual partners can convert destructive conflict into constructive cooperation. The program's true legacy lives not in physical monuments or museum exhibitions, but in the democratic Germany that emerged from totalitarian ruins, built significantly by men who learned freedom's deepest meaning not through force or compulsion, but through patient education that respected their dignity as thinking human beings. The transformation of German prisoners through American university education remains powerful testimony to democracy's greatest strength and most enduring advantage. Its fundamental confidence that given access to uncensored knowledge and genuine education conducted with academic integrity, human beings will choose freedom over tyranny, cooperation over conflict, and construction over destruction. They will make these choices not because they are forced to, but because education opens minds to possibilities they had never imagined and values they had been taught to despise. In the end, the most powerful weapon in democracy's arsenal proved to be neither overwhelming military might nor vast economic power, but the simple yet profoundly revolutionary act of opening minds through honest education. The university professors who volunteered their time, the administrators who designed programs with care and respect, and the prisoners who seized the opportunity for genuine learning together created something that outlasted the war itself and helped build a lasting peace. They demonstrated that education, freely offered and freely accepted, could transform not just individuals but entire nations, turning yesterday's enemies into tomorrow's partners in building a more peaceful and prosperous world for all.